Welcome to When Hope Breathes, the Resilient People of the Sudans. My name is Anita Sanborn. I serve as the president of the board of the American Friends of the Episcopal Church of the Sudans. And you know, AFRECS has been in active connection and friendship with the people of the Sudans for over 20 years. We have stood together with the Sudanese in times of war, through floods and famine and revolution and all kinds of strife, as well as standing together in celebration when independence came and all the joys and hopes of building a new nation. Tonight we are in for a treat, a rare experience as we listen and later join in to the conversation between two men who have devoted much of their lives to peacemaking and peace building in the Sudans. I'm going to introduce our own Dane Smith, and then he will introduce Ambassador Donald Booth. Ambassador Dane Smith is the current Executive Director of AFRECS, and he's had a long career in the international peace building business, shall we say. He was the senior advisor on Darfur in the Office of the U.S. Special Envoy to Sudan in 2011 and 2012. In search of a peaceful solution to the Darfur conflict in Sudan, he led the drafting of a U.S. government strategy on Darfur. Dane has been involved in the mid-2000s as senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., where he authored U.S. Peace Fair, Organizing American Peacebuilding Operations. I think that has to go into a second printing.
I wish.
Dane was the U.S. ambassador to Senegal, 1996 to 99, and he was also the U.S. ambassador to Guinea in the early 90s. From 1999 to 2003, he served as president of the National Peace Corps Association, the alumni group for former U.S. Peace Corps volunteers. Anybody remember the Peace Corps? Raise your hands. Yes. He and his wife Judith served as Peace Corps volunteers in, I never know if it's Eritrea or, thank you, Eritrea, and it was then part of Ethiopia. Dane earned his bachelor's degree from Harvard College and his PhD in international relations from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. He also studied at the Union Theological Seminary in New York, and he and Judy have 3 children and 7 grandchildren, and I think one of them is here with us. Hi, Alex. So with that, I will hand this microphone to Dane, and please, let's all be present for this wonderful conversation. Maybe you don't need.
Thank you, Anita. Much too long an introduction to me. My job here is to introduce our speaker tonight, a very distinguished American diplomat, Ambassador Don Booth. We're honored to have him with us. He has the distinction of having been both the U.S. Special Envoy for Sudan and South Sudan, 2013 to 2017 under President Obama, and then again Special Envoy for Sudan, 2019 to 21 under President Trump. I think that must be a first for a Special Envoy. He comes originally from New York State, graduated from Georgetown. He was a Foreign Service officer rising through the ranks to become a 3-time ambassador. That's very distinguished. First to Liberia, and then consecutively to Zambia and Ethiopia. And his expertise on the Horn of Africa made him a logical choice as Special Envoy for the Sudans, which came after that Ethiopia assignment. So welcome. So let me launch our discussion tonight with this question. So the war in Sudan has now entered its fourth year, tragically. Just how bad is the situation in Sudan?
Well, thank you, Dane, and thanks to everyone for coming tonight. I see nobody decided to take the seats in the front row. No, that's where the envelopes with cash are.
We're Episcopalians.
So, conflict. It's a tragedy for Sudan, an absolute tragedy. The numbers, I'll cite the numbers, but they don't begin to describe the destruction of a country. 14 out of roughly 45 million people, 14 million out of 45 million, have been displaced by this conflict. Almost 5 million of those displaced outside of the country. 4 million, the UN estimates, are currently extremely malnourished. There have been pockets of famine that have cropped up from time to time over the past year. 60% of the population is in need of humanitarian assistance, and over a third of the medical facilities in the country have been destroyed. Plus the capital city has been destroyed, and most of the major urban areas west of the Nile Valley. There has been an atrocious bloodletting, ethnic killing on a massive scale. First in El Geneina by the Rapid Support Forces, which the US government has termed to be a genocide against the Masalit people. Then with the capture after an 18-month siege of El Fasher in West Darfur, with again tens of thousands of people killed both during the siege and immediately after the takeover of the town. But the forces of the Sudan Armed Forces are also guilty of heinous crimes when they retook the Gezira scheme, which is between the White and Blue Nile south of Khartoum. There were retribution killings. When they retook this capital, Khartoum, and Omdurman, the neighboring city, there were retribution killings. The US government has officially declared that the Sudan Armed Forces have used chemical weapons against their own people. They are now flying drones against civilian targets, both sides. So this is a very bloody conflict, and civilians are as much, if not more, in the crosshairs than the combatants. I mentioned the humanitarian need, 60% of the population. Well, the Western donors got together in Berlin last month and pledged $1.5 billion of assistance. The problem is, how do you get it there? You can't do cross-line. The quote government, which has moved from Port Sudan back to Khartoum, is saying, you can't go to the rebel areas, that'll just fuel the conflict. Getting it to areas controlled by the RSF requires a very circuitous route through places like the Central African Republic and Chad. And so there's a trickle of humanitarian assistance getting in. And last year, 2025, I think the figure is only about 1/3 of the UN appeal for humanitarian assistance was actually met. I mean, part of it's frustration of we can pledge, but we can't deliver. And part of it also is, as you've, I'm sure, all heard, the massive cutbacks in assistance, including humanitarian assistance by the United States and other traditional donors. So it's a terrible situation that we're in. And unfortunately, both sides seem to believe that they can still achieve a military victory, and the people of Sudan will simply have to put up with ongoing conflict.
This is not Sudan's first civil war. It was deeply involved in the civil war of the South when I first arrived in Khartoum in 1986. Why has Sudan experienced civil wars, and why has the military played such a dominant role in Sudan's government?
Well, Ben, you're correct. This is not Sudan's first civil war by any means. The country has basically been at war with itself since independence. Why? I think it really comes down to a failure of the leadership of Sudan to come up with a method of governance that would recognize the diversity of Sudan and be inclusive. And part of this is the colonial legacy. The Anglo-Egyptian condominium over Sudan. The view was very much an Egyptian view, which is you control the Nile River Valley and that controls the country. So you've got this idea of people from the center, those tribes along the Nile Valley, that they were the ones to rule Sudan. Now, in Egypt, where 90% of the population lives within 10 miles of the Nile River, and you have a homogeneous population, that kind of system has worked, sort of. In Sudan, it's been a disaster. So you've constantly had this center-periphery conflict. At independence in 1956, the South had already started a rebellion against the forces from Khartoum. And that was the first Anyanya, the first uprising. And it went on until a peace agreement was reached in 1972 under President Nimeri, where he brought up Southerner up to be his vice president, and everything was sort of papered over, but nothing really changed. And so the SPLM, the Sudan People's Liberation Movement under John Garang, launched Anyanya 2 in 1983. So 11 years of peace, relatively. And that continued, frankly, until the US and IGAD's the regional organization for the Horn of Africa, managed to broker the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, or CPA, in 2005, which led to the idea of a referendum in 2011 on South Sudan's independence, and was the resolution of the Southern Rebellion. But there are other ones. In 1989, the Beja in the east of Sudan rose up, and that was pretty much put down militarily. But then we had the Darfur conflict, which started in 2003, where Darfuri tribes had risen against the government in Khartoum. And that war, frankly, continued sporadically with genocide occurring then until 2020, when you had the Juba Peace Agreement. So this is nothing new for Sudan, this civil conflict. Why has the military played such a big role in the state? My answer to that is Sudan actually was at independence, had relatively well-developed political parties, labor unions, professional associations, academic institutions, and a military. But because it was at war with itself from birth, the military became the dominant of those institutions. And there were reasons that particularly the civilian political parties became rather feckless and splintered and were unable to provide effective government. So the military kept taking over. You had the coup in 1964, you had Nimeri's coup in I think it was 69. It was one coup after another where the military took over. The main one being Bashir's coup in 1989, which was really an Islamist Muslim Brotherhood coup backed by the army, in which over the 30 years of Bashir's rule, the army managed to sideline the Muslim Brothers. But they're on the rebound. And the whole issue of how to govern Sudan, how to govern a diverse country of many tribes, ethnicities, religions, cultures. I can't underestimate the animosity that exists between agriculturalists and pastoralists. Yes. And you see this playing out across the entire Sahel and now the northern stretches of West Africa as well.
So we frequently have people coming from Sudan to the United States when they can get visas, and saying the United States needs to do something about it. Can you talk a bit about the role of the United States over all these years?
Well, we've been had a long history with Sudan. I would say we've often been the mediator or attempted to be the peacemaker. We've had highs and lows. I'll just cite two lows. One was the assassination of our ambassador in Khartoum in 1973. And another one was when we decided after our embassies in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam were attacked by Al Qaeda, that there was a chemical weapons factory in Khartoum that needed to be bombed. I think it turned out to be a baby food factory, but we bombed it anyway. So, yeah, bombing things is not new to our foreign policy. Highs, in the early 1980s, when I was actually desk officer for Sudan at the State Department, Sudan was our largest recipient of assistance, both military and economic, in Africa. They were a key partner in countering Muammar Gaddafi's Libya. At that point, if you remember, we ended up bombing Libya in 1986 in response to a bombing that killed many US servicemen in Berlin. But at that time, that cooperation was very important to us. I would say another high was the comprehensive peace agreement. And we were working with EGAD, with the regional organization in the Horn of Africa, particularly Kenyans and the Ethiopians. We were able to bring an end to this really endless civil war with the South. And then the third high, I would say, is actually in 2019, when the US actually played a behind-the-scenes role in getting the civilian-led transitional government established after the revolution of December 2018 and the ongoing revolt on the streets of most Sudanese cities. So those are the highs. Now, sorry. We've played a role as peacemakers in Sudan as well. And we actually were able to use sanctions and also our state sponsor of terrorism designation, I think, exceedingly effectively in changing for the better events in Sudan. When I was envoy the first time, one of the things we worked on, particularly in the last year, I was there 2016, was in getting the Sudanese to stop their annual military campaigns against the SPLM North in South Kordofan and against the Darfuris rebel groups in Darfur. They stopped the aerial bombardment. They did a number of other things we wanted. And as a result, at the end of the Obama administration, we decided we would lift the US sanctions on Sudan. Now, President Bashir had been telling his people for a decade, 2 decades, that everything was bad in Sudan because of US sanctions. And then he made the mistake of touting this. See what I did? I got the Americans to lift sanctions. In less than 2 years, the Sudanese people said things aren't getting any better, and it's not because of sanctions, it's because of you. And that was the December 2018 uprising. State sponsor of terrorism, that was a really tricky one. And that's also something that I worked on when I went back the second time, not as a presidential special envoy, but as a State Department special envoy. And so we had to resolve the claims of US victims of the East Africa embassy bombings, because they had won court cases that implicated Sudan as having supported the Al-Qaeda operatives who did those bombings. And we had to make sure that Sudan met all the criteria that it was indeed not supporting terrorism. We made that case, and indeed at the very end of the Trump administration, the SST designation, we had rescission of that. And Congress went along with it, ratified it. And as a result of that, the transitional government actually had a major boost in the arm. We pledged over $700 million in assistance. The IMF and the World Bank were able to do business in Sudan again. And Sudan quickly met the criteria for the decision point, not the completion point, but the decision point for debt relief. And debt of over $56 billion had been hanging over their heads. So this was important direction. But guess what happened before that $700 billion could be dispersed? Well, we had a change of administration, so that slowed things down a bit. We had to discuss what we're going to do with it. The World Bank and the IMF were moving through their processes, et cetera. But then there was the coup in October of 2021. I was no longer envoy then, so it's not my fault. Why did you have the coup? I think the main reason that both General Burhan and the Sudan Armed Forces, General Hemeti and the Rapid Support Forces decided to do away with the civilian transitional government was that one of the things that the government was doing is they had this thing called a dismantling committee. And it was trying to dismantle the holdings of the Muslim Brotherhood, of the army, of the RSF, and of the former Bashir regime. They wanted to get the economy out of the hands of those people. And they had been cautioned that this is, if you break somebody's rice bowl, they're going to react. So go about it carefully. They got a bit, I think, too aggressive. So I think that might be really the proximate cause of it. And the other thing is that these benefits hadn't yet arrived from outside for the civilians in the government to show that they really could deliver. And the other problem is that civilian support among the population had been, I think, a bit hollowed out because, for example, Prime Minister Hamdok, he was a UN official. He was not a politician. He was not the kind of guy who could go out into the community and drum up grassroots support for the government. And so there was this disconnect between the grassroots, the resistance committees that had launched the revolution in December of 2018. And yes, they were happy to have civilians in government, but active support of it had kind of dwindled. And I think the generals felt this was a good time to sort of take control. It's interesting that General Hemeti, though, within a few months of that coup, said publicly that he had made a big mistake. Because while you had the civilian, you had a tripod. You had the civilians, you had the SAF, and you had the RSF. And they kind of could each balance each other out. Once they got rid of the civilians, this was a two-legged stool, and it was not stable. And indeed, you had that falling out, despite, again, massive US effort in conjunction with the UN and IGAD to try to put a civilian government back in place, try to undo the coup. That didn't succeed, though there was progress being made. And the one issue that seemed to be the stumbling block was how quickly the RSF could be integrated into the Sudan Armed Forces. That was the quote, the issue that triggered the civil war. But in reality, my take, and people can debate this, and I don't have firsthand knowledge, I don't have access to the intel, but what I've heard from so many sources is that really what happened, what triggered it was, again, the Islamists from the Bashir regime saying, this is the time to go after the RSF. They're becoming too strong. They control the urban areas. They outnumber us. We've got to strike now while we've got support from abroad, mainly Egypt. And they did strike. And the RSF responded. The dust up at the airport at Merowe, the military airport, then became the next day fighting in Khartoum. And pretty soon you have the Sudan Armed Forces, the government, so to speak, decamping to Port Sudan on the Red Sea, and the RSF controlling large swaths of Sudan in the west and in the center. Again, the US has tried to intervene. Our role, again, is a mediator. As soon as the civil war broke out, we joined with the Saudis in the Jeddah process. And when that sort of petered out, we are now leading the Quad. The Quad is the US, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. And those last three are the key external backers of this conflict.
So, Master Booth, there are other mediation efforts supposedly afoot to try to resolve the situation in Sudan. What's going on with them and why have they not succeeded up to the present?
Well, a couple of reasons. I'll start with Jeddah, the Jeddah process. First of all, it focused on General Hemeti and General Burhan, the RSF and the SAF. And those two were not really serious about trying to make peace. They had external backers and they firmly believed they could win the conflict. Why any Sudanese could think you could win the civil war in that country is beyond me, because throughout their history, there was never a military solution to their civil wars. But there was also, at the same time, you had Jeddah, which the Saudis never got the sense were particularly active. They like to host it, they like to be seen as involved, but I didn't get the impression that they were really putting the political weight that they could have put behind the effort. You had a proliferation of efforts at the same time. You had the African Union, which said this is an African problem, it needs an African solution. You had EGAD, which said yes, but it's a regional problem, so it needs a regional solution. You had the UN, the Europeans, trying to be somewhat helpful, but ending up opening up alternative routes for mediation. And then you had Egypt, which very cleverly said, it's really the neighbors who need to decide this. So they had a meeting of the neighbors. Well, if you're a Sudanese and you don't like what you're hearing from one mediator, you go to the other mediator. And so we had this forum shopping. And it wasn't only the governments focused on the military actors, but it was also this proliferation of international NGOs, which I supported one of them in a pro bono capacity, but working with the Sudanese civilians. And so the Sudanese civilians also had different forums. You didn't like who, one group like Pro Mediation, the French group, you didn't like who they were inviting, so you decided to go to somebody else's meeting. It was going around in circles. I think the Quad, which was really formed during the current administration of the 4 key countries or three key regional backers, is actually a much more useful approach. Because if you're going to bring peace to Sudan, you are first and foremost going to have to find a way to reconcile or find compromises the interests of those 3 players. I don't think they're irreconcilable. And there are a lot of other things, and we've all heard about the Saudi Emirati split over Yemen. They're splitting over OPEC now, diverging in their approaches to the war with Iran. So Sudan's not the only thing that they have different views on, but as long as Egypt and Saudi Arabia are going to continue to support the armed forces, Sudan armed forces, and the Emiratis are going to continue to support the rapid support forces, though of course everybody denies they're actually doing this. The Sudanese sides are going to say, why not keep fighting? We have a chance of winning this. So that is absolutely critical, is getting those key players. But then you have other players in the region. The Turks have gotten involved. The Qataris are involved. The Pakistanis are almost to get involved as well, but the Saudis kind of put the kibosh on that. And then the other thing that seemingly nobody really is taking, I don't think, too seriously right now, are the interests of the neighboring states. Set Egypt aside, it's in the Quad, but Eritrea is very much backing the Sudan armed forces for their own reasons, because they have ethnic kin across the border and they want to keep their ethnic kin on the good side of things in the eastern part of Sudan. And besides, they can then stick it to Ethiopia that they've had their falling out with. The Ethiopians are basically saying the Sudanese have never been very friendly to us. When we turned our back to go fight our fellow countrymen in Tigray a few years ago, they took part of our territory. So are they supporting the RSF? You bet you. South Sudan. Okay. SPLM, Sudan People's Liberation Movement. Sudan People's Liberation Movement North. That's that affinity between Southern Kordofan and South Sudan. So yes, the South Sudanese, there are a lot of South Sudanese fighting in the ranks of the RSF. Chad, that's an interesting story. The RSF is predominantly a Rizigat tribe-led organization. Blood enemies with the Zagawa. President Deby in Chad is a Zagawa, but has been supporting the RSF in order to somehow keep some balance within his own internal politics. Now that fighting has actually spilled several times across the border in Chad, this may be changing. You have Haftar, who controls the eastern part of Libya, again supporting the RSF. Central African Republic, I think probably not a major player in this, but. So anyway, if you ignore the interest, particularly of countries like Ethiopia and Eritrea and South Sudan, you're again going to have, if not the same level of support for the ongoing conflict, at least some support. So they need to be taken into account. And then finally, the Sudanese people need to have some say in this. They can't and do not want another sort of power sharing agreement among the generals foisted upon them. This is what happened in South Sudan, and they don't want that to happen there. And so, how do you get the Sudanese civilians to come up with a plan? They really need to lay out a vision. One, for how the country can be governed inclusively. Two, for what the role of religion in the country is going to be, because that's a very divisive issue. Three, what's the future for the generals? Because these generals aren't going to stop fighting if you basically say, okay, once we take over, you guys are going to the ICC, the International Criminal Court. Not going to stop fighting for that, sorry. So you don't want them to be in power, but what are you going to offer them? What are the compromises? What's the sort of the starting point for a negotiation? That's absolutely critical to articulate. And unfortunately, I've yet to see Sudanese civilians come together cohesively enough to put out such a plan. They're more interested in who they will talk to, who can't be in the next government, rather than coming up with something that's at least put down a plan A, a plan B, a plan C, put something out there. And you have to involve the grassroots, the resistance committees that have sponsored these emergency response rooms, which have been feeding people, providing minimal health care, basically keeping Sudanese civilians alive during this conflict.
You mentioned South Sudan, and there's certainly people in this room that are very much interested in South Sudan. Talk a little bit about the situation in South Sudan and the instability there and what appears to be deterioration of the situation.
I'm sorry, I know we have some South Sudanese in the room and our former ambassador to South Sudan in the room, but I don't hold out much hope. I really don't. I could go back a ways. John Garang, who was the leader of the Sudan People's Liberation Movement, was a brilliant politician. You know, he started out the rebellion in 1983. He was backed by the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union collapsed, he reinvented himself and became the champion of Christians versus Muslims, i.e. Southern versus Northern, of African versus Arab. And as a result, he built a coalition in the US Congress that was fully supportive of the efforts to get to the Comprehensive Peace Agreement and for South Sudan to vote for independence and to have support for an independent South Sudan. And I think what we forgot in this whole process was that South Sudan wasn't really all united behind the Sudan People's Liberation Movement. In fact, Riek Machar, who has been periodically vice president, is a socialist again, actually sided with the Nuer tribe that he was a leader of, sided with the Numeri government in Khartoum, fighting the SPLM North. So we shouldn't have been too surprised that these ethnic animosities existed at independence of South Sudan. Unfortunately, neither Salva Kiir, the president, though never elected president, was elected president of the southern region of Sudan, not president of South Sudan, because they never had an election, was not the person who really had a vision for the country. There was no sense of building a South Sudanese identity. And this really struck me because when I was in Zambia, it was another country that inherited colonial borders that included very diverse tribes who had fought each other for many generations. And yet the first president there, Kenneth Kaunda, every day, radio, television, newspapers, every speech he gave, one Zambia, one people, one nation. He had programs like sending the high school graduating classes off to the north of Zambia, all the tribes mixed together in a civilian conservation corps type camp set up where they would plant trees to reforest the northern part of the country, so there'd be lumber for the copper industry. They began to realize that, oh, those member girls, they're cute too. They don't have 3 ears like I was told growing up. This really helped build cohesion that has kept Zambia at peace. They haven't had a civil war. You could cite Tanzania as well, Julius Nyerere. Like Kaunda, terrible economic policies, nationalized everything, socialist regime, ruined the economies, but they built nations. And that did not happen in South Sudan. And South Sudan was also cursed because it was born with the golden spoon of oil income in its mouth. And as a result, there was money for the taking. And even in the years leading up to independence, the leaders of what was going to be South Sudan figured out ways to take a fair amount of that. There was hardly any investment in roads, schools, clinics, education, building a civil service. So the nation basically was marginally governed when the Civil War broke out in 2013. And that Civil War broke out in 3 stages. The first was in July or August of 2013, when Kiir basically fired his cabinet. He fired the cabinet, people like Pagan Moon and Dana Lore, people the US had worked very closely with, but they were the Garang boys. And they had the temerity over Kiir's objection when there was this dispute right after independence with Sudan about how much Sudan would be paid to export South Sudan's oil through the pipeline to Port Sudan. They had the temerity saying, we're cutting off our oil production to spite the Sudanese. So Kiir he remembered this. And 2 years later, he took his revenge and he moved them aside. Then he had a party congress. And he organized it in a way that he managed to marginalize pretty much anybody who wasn't supporting him and his Dinka Jane Council group. Again, he's a Dinka, so they're the majority tribe, not majority, 40% population. So that was the second phase. That was in early December. And then December 21st, I think it was, there was the move against the New Air soldiers in the Presidential Guard. And that devolved within hours into a kill all the New Air in Juba. So you had the beginnings, and Riek Machar, who was the New Air leader, he fled, he got to the bush, he reorganized the New Air White Army, and the Civil War was off and running. And it ebbed and flowed. Kiir got support from Uganda. I remember Ugandan jets flying over and bombing Machar's positions. For a time, it looked like Machar's forces might actually take Juba. It was pretty touch and go there. And what did we do? We sent our special envoy in to tell both sides, you need to get to the negotiating table. And we didn't want to actually lead this process, so we did what we did before Southern Sudan. We partnered with IGAD. And at that time, the Ethiopians were pretty much IGAD, and their former foreign minister, Sayum Mehdi, said, if the US is in this, we're doing it. And we worked together very closely. We managed to get Kenya, reluctantly Uganda, and reluctantly Sudan on board when President Obama went out to Addis in August, I think it was May or June of 2015. And he kind of got the regional leaders to agree, okay, we need to put an end to this. And the region came together and basically forced Salva Kiir to accept a power sharing agreement. Where Riek Machar would be first vice president of 2 vice presidents at that time. And his forces would come into Juba, the army would be integrated, government would be formed, peace would bloom. It fell apart a year later. Machar was chased out of Juba at gunpoint, chased through the bush, and eventually rescued by the UN on his deathbed in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Sporadic fighting followed, and one of the things that it wasn't just sort of Dinka New Air, I think that's kind of indicated on the map, but Salva Kiir's forces went against the Shilluk in the north. And the chase to try to capture Machar through Equatoria, which is in the southern part of South Sudan. Well, if you put South Sudan now. That managed to antagonize huge numbers of Equatorians, who for the most part had basically said, you know, we're agriculturalists, we're staying out of this fight between you cattle herders. But the fight was brought to them, and so you then had even more armed groups formed in Equatoria to fight the government. So things were pretty chaotic, and IGAD, somehow the Ugandans and the Sudanese, who never seemed to agree on anything, in 2018, got together and cracked heads, and there was the revitalized peace agreement, which again formed a power sharing agreement. Riek Machar became first vice president with 4 other vice presidents needed to kind of spread the wealth around. And again, there was a whole list of things that had to be done. Elections were going to be held, I think, in 2020, if not, I forget exactly when, but they never happened, of course. The electoral commission was never funded. The armies were never really demobilized. There was no integration of forces. And this last year, the New Era White Army made a few raids, and that was the Salva Kiir's excuse for arresting Riek Machar again and launching campaigns against New Era forces throughout the country. So right now, as far as I can tell, it's just sporadic fighting throughout the country. There really is no governance outside of Juba and the oil fields. And the oil does keep pumping, though admittedly less and less each year. So there's less and less to pocket. But there's enough to go around to keep this thing humming along while Salva Kiir contemplates his mortality and who might succeed him. And anybody who thinks they might succeed him probably doesn't last more than about 6 months before they get shunted someplace else. Right now, talking about maybe his daughter succeed. I don't know. But I wish I could be more optimistic about South Sudan, but until you have a leader who can try to build a national identity and try to start healing the wounds of now 13 years of civil war, it's going to be a really hard sell.
So I think we open it up for questions at this point, and then perhaps at the end you can make some final remarks. So questions?
Please.
Just a question about kind of the current role of Uganda. It seems from what I've read that they're still heavily supporting the Kiir government, even though they pretend to be one of the regional players trying to solve things. I'm just curious about an update on their role.
From what I have read, they still have armed forces in South Sudan, in and around Juba. They are sort of a security guarantee, if you will, for Salva Kiir. Because, again, with oil money declining, he's not able to pay all his troops. He doesn't pay the civil servants, but got to pay the troops, otherwise they might rise up against you. As far as I can tell, that the Tiger Battalion and some of the Presidential Guard are getting paid, but it's good to have that external security blanket, and that's what Uganda is providing. And why are they providing it? Again, a lot of lucrative contracts back and forth across that border. That's where just about all the trade with South Sudan goes through now, particularly since the chaos in Sudan, where the Nile River route never really reopened in a major way. So it's the road that the US built to Ninuwe on the Ugandan border. That's the main trade route, and that's where Uganda gets a lot of economic benefit out of South Sudan. Diane?
Do I understand that a lot of refugees are spilling over into Uganda?
They have periodically. The Ugandans, I think in the past, basically have not really allowed UNHCR to establish refugee camps per se. They kind of integrate them into the local population to a certain extent. But I haven't followed that particularly closely. But yeah, there are South Sudanese refugees in Uganda. There are Sudanese refugees in South Sudan. There used to be a lot more South Sudanese refugees in Sudan, but that's now moved the other way as the fighting has spilled around the border areas. version.
Back to Sudan. How can you stop the UAE from funding the RSF and seems to me keeping the civil war, famine and the whole thing going,
Well,
our ally UAE?
I would take exception to how you frame the question, because how do you convince Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Turkey and Qatar to stop supporting the Sudan Armed Forces, which is also keeping the war going? It takes two to tango. And the Emiratis have a very legitimate concern about having a resurgence of a Muslim Brother government in Sudan. I mean, don't forget, we went through a period where Osama bin Laden was welcomed there by the Muslim Brothers. Almost every radical Islamist terrorist group had training camps in Sudan after Bashir and the Muslim Brothers took power in 1989. So there's some real concerns that are legitimate.
But the Emiratis mining the riches of Sudan, or their minerals that they're taking out?
Everybody's mining it and sneaking it out whoever they can. Yeah, a lot of the gold mines are in SAF controlled areas in the north of Sudan. So they're all benefiting from it.
When Dan and I were in Khartoum, 1986 to 89, I taught at the University of Khartoum and at Afad University College for Women. And I'm wondering now about the state of education, both university and lower education in Sudan and also in South Sudan.
Well, I'm pretty sure that the main campus of Khartoum University is in ruins right now, because it was right at the epicenter of fighting when the war broke out and the fighting took place in Khartoum. I don't know whether it has actually reopened. It probably has, to some extent. The government the Sudan Armed Forces government is trying to bring life back to normal in Khartoum. You know, they renovated the airport, they renovated ministries. I don't know how much attention they paid to the universities there.
Omdurman, what about the campuses in Omdurman? That's where I was teaching.
Again, Omdurman was a battleground throughout, both when the RSF to kick the Sudan Armed Forces basically out of the capital region, except for army headquarters and one or two other bases that were near the capital. They basically, General Burhan was encircled and it was basically impossible. In the Sudan Armed Forces headquarters in the center of Khartoum for months, where he managed to escape through a tunnel. In terms of South Sudan, Juba University, as far as I know, is still functioning. But you know, I don't, again, there's really no government resources being put into education that I can tell.
You have an online question.
Okay.
So can the US take strong action on South Sudan, and what can the US do more than sanctions?
There really is nothing that the US can do to put Humpty Dumpty back together again in South Sudan. I mean, we have sanctioned various leaders. We've tried to cut off their funds. But again, those funds are generally held in places like Kenya, which doesn't like to actually seize assets, and other countries that, for their own reasons, Uganda, etc. So I know the South Sudanese sort of feel almost let down, like we were with them throughout the whole CPA process. We were the ones that encouraged, the vote for independence. We were the ones that were there in the very beginning with our advisors and our aid programs to get this new government up and running and help make this new country succeed. But even with all of that will and resources we had at the time, we couldn't make the country. They had to make the country. And so it's really put the challenge back on South Sudanese. How are you going to come together to stop hating each other, stop fighting each other, and figure out a way to to live together and have a government that's going to invest the resources of the state, and there's still considerable resources in the state, in building the country. But no external power can do that. The US certainly isn't gonna send the 82nd Airborne in to fix things in Juba. What we try to do basically is help South Sudanese survive, and we've been a massive contributor of humanitarian assistance. I think last year it was like, maybe it was, I think it was 2025, it was $600 million of humanitarian assistance. That's huge. And if we could have been helping them build their country with $600 million, imagine the progress that could have been made. But, you know, humanitarian aid is a bit of, it's a Band-Aid in the way it's going into South Sudan and Sudan at this point too.
Any other questions? Oh, yes.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think you nailed it when you said South Sudan is missing leadership. You know, John Garang, when he was alive, was able to bring people together, including the Northerners, under one umbrella. But the current leadership is lacking that. So if you look at the current government in Juba, it's comprised of many different tribes, but these people are just for themselves. They're not for the people of South Sudan. So what South Sudan needs right now is what you mentioned. A leader that is going to unite people and heal the wounds of separation and tribalism. Sorry.
Yeah, fully agree with you. And you know, it's really, it's one of those questions of history, you know, if John Garang hadn't died the year the CPA was signed in 2005 in a helicopter accident, he had a vision for a new Sudan. He wasn't looking for independence for South Sudan. He was looking to create a Sudan where Southerners were equal citizens with the denizens of the Nile Valley, with the Darfuris, with the Beja in the east. That was his vision of Sudan. And he did have support in the north for that. Again, it wasn't universal support south, and it certainly wasn't universal support in the north, but he did manage to pull from all different parts of the country. His death, that was the end. There was no one else who had that vision, that charisma, that political skill. And so, you know, an accident of history, you know, we'll never know what could have happened.
I just have a question about the role of the church in civil society. Many of us in this room are connected in relationship through the Episcopal Church, through the Catholic Church, through other denominations. And our efforts seem to be the thin bond that is kind of stretching. And we need to provide hope. We need what the title of this talk is pointing to. So can you give us any advice about how to keep that going, how to keep that relationship and support for the churches in South Sudan?
The churches in South Sudan, they did play a role. They were actually a bridging mechanism, a glue, if you will, in the period leading up to independence. And they did hold sway over some of the politicians. You know, Salva Kiir was Catholic, and you know, the bishop talked to him. You know, he might listen to some extent. René Bouchard, I believe, was Presbyterian. There was some influence, and in fact, when I went to Juba right after the fighting started in December 2013, I was there before Christmas, and one of the first things that Ambassador Susan Page and I did was we called on a lot of the religious leaders to say, you know, can you use your influence to try to get these guys to see some sense and knock this off before it becomes an ingrained ethnic conflict. Pretty much already was because the way they targeted the new area in Juba, but there was still this hope that, you know, that the churches could have enough, that they could play that role they had played in the lead up to independence in bringing together various parts of South Sudanese society. They tried. Unfortunately, at that point, the politicians weren't listening anymore. Now, my British colleague, counterpart, Special Envoy from the UK, he very much tried to take this up. He got Archbishop Canterbury Welby engaged. He got the Archbishop to talk to the Pope, and actually the Pope did a visit to South Sudan. Again, trying to talk some sense, you know, love thy neighbor, stop this fighting. And, you know, the visit was, you know, well received and everything, but nothing changed. So I think it's kind of like being, you know, a government mediator. You have to just keep at it, and work the grassroots. I think that's where we sometimes kind of lose leverage that we might otherwise have, because it's so hard to connect with the grassroots, so that people will actually begin to stand up for their own interests, for their own country. You know, if you deal with just the civilian political leaders, you know, their party will probably splinter in 3 weeks because somebody else wants to be the leader instead of the deputy. This has happened so many times, particularly in Sudan. Or the party's all about me as an individual. And the grassroots get excluded from the political discussion because these people also don't listen to them. But I think the churches can try to build a little bit of that groundswell, if you will, to say enough is enough. You know, our lives are ruined, our children's lives are ruined. We don't want our grandchildren's lives ruined by all this. We need to come together.
One more question,
Don, thanks so much. Great conversation, great insights. I was really intrigued by your comment, sort of behind the scene, the US played behind the scenes a role in 2018, I think, to sort of help the civilian government emerge. We're not used to the US behind the scenes civilian government when you think of Iran, Chile, Guatemala. Can you elaborate a little bit more? And is this a bit of a template that we should be thinking of, how to engage in sort of transitional societies to help democratic or civilian regimes emerge?
Well, I was asked to come back as special envoy. I think it was June 5th or 6th. June 3rd was when there was the massacre of civilians demonstrating in front of the Army headquarters. And there was such an outrage in Congress and so much pressure that said, okay, we need to have somebody focused on this full time. So I went out to Khartoum, and you know, the military guys were, you know, we're going to have a military council. We're going to set things right. We'll have elections eventually. Don't worry. But we also, of course, met with the Forces for Freedom and Change, which at the time was most of the political parties, including even the Communist Party. They never joined in. It was the professional association. It was what was left of labor unions. It had representatives of the grassroots resistance committees, neighborhood resistance committees. And they were trying to figure out a way to have a civilian government, get rid of the generals, and they were negotiating. I then started going around the region, particularly to Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. Those 3 countries, because we had to convince all of them that it was in their interest to stop Sudan from sliding into chaos. The June 3rd massacre, if you will, was a bit of a wake-up call that the army didn't have control. The thought was that after Bashir left, the army, the military, the security organizations would be able to control things in Sudan. June 3rd showed that the people could be cowed, but they then planned a massive demonstration for June 30th. And in that period, I was traveling among those countries, trying to explain things, trying to explain to the Egyptians, for example, that Sudan is not Egypt. People don't live 10 miles from the Nile River. You can't control them the way you do here. Talking with the Emiratis about the different sort of ethnic players and how this could all unravel and affect their economic interests in the country. The same with the Saudis. And then in order to try to avoid a repetition of June 3rd, a group of the civilians met with General Hemeti secretly to try to figure out how to come up with something that would avoid another massacre. And I made that public, that they were talking. And once it was public that they were talking, they couldn't back away from it. And so they continued to talk. And then they got signals from the parties that I had been traveling around the region, telling them, yeah, you should talk because you need to come up with some solution. Now, people have accused me, the US, of dictating what came out as the civilian-led transitional government. Frankly, I was flying in and out of Khartoum, talking with everybody. We certainly were not dictating how that was going to come out. That was something that they came up with. They drafted the political declaration and the transitional constitution all on their own. And there were chapters of it that I looked at and cringed and said, this is going to come back to bite you. Like the chapter on the judiciary was, I think, one sentence, which will be, the judiciary will be independent after it is reformed. What does that mean? They, on August 17th of 2019, I was in Khartoum when everybody sat around and everybody signed this transitional constitution, selected Abdullah Hamdok as the prime minister. He led a technocratic civilian government with the exception of two ministries. Of course, the defense and the Ministry of Interior were reserved for the military to choose. And the Sovereign Council, which was like the executive, but actually had very limited powers per the Constitution, was to be headed over the first, I think it was 24 months by the military, and then revert to a civilian who would head the Sovereignty Council, and the head of the Sovereignty Council would be the head of state. Now, why did things fall apart? One thing I didn't mention, and it's important to my mind anyway, is COVID. Because maintaining this sort of regional consensus that this transitional government was the least worst option required constant tending of the garden. George Shultz saying diplomacy is all about tending the garden. And unfortunately, I could not, and the US couldn't tend the garden. The UN envoy couldn't tend the garden. The British envoy couldn't tend the garden because we couldn't travel to those countries. And you cannot deal with Middle Easterners on Zoom. I'm sorry, it does not work. So that was part of the problem. And I think then messages began to diverge from the region and led the two generals to think that we really don't need these civilians who are trying to raid our piggy bank and are somehow insisting that they're going to be the head of state in the next couple of months. When the Sovereignty Council should have shifted. Another complicating factor I'll just throw in there is the long-running rebellion of Darfur, plus a few other places, was brought to an end by the Juba Peace Agreement of October of 2020. The Juba Peace Agreement was great. We finally got the Justice and Equality Movement, Mini Malawi, Sudan Liberation Front, all these, to finally stop fighting and agree to be part of the government. Unfortunately, what they did was they all wanted their positions and their cars, their houses, and their access to resources. And they didn't integrate their forces. They just brought their troops to Khartoum, so the city became even more militarized. And this did not really lead. And what it did also is because they were then getting cabinet posts, that the technocrats were being pushed aside. And so there was a lot less cohesion in the civilian in the later months.
Thank you.
What do you all want to know?
Thank you very much.
Ambassador, we have one more online, just want to know if they could get it in.
Okay, we're over time, but one more question.
Okay, they were begging, I'm sorry.
As much as you can online.
The question is, I'm sorry, I'm trying to get back to it, okay. Why is the US supporting one ethnic group, the Nur, when the IO, the White Army, are committing massacres against the Dinka, Shilluk, Murlo, etc.? For example, the Phenom massacre that resulted in the killing of more than 200 innocent civilians.
Well, to my knowledge, the US is not and never has supported one ethnic group in South Sudan. Clearly, when the Nuer were massacred in Juba, we called a spade and said this was ethnic killing. But we have also, I think, been consistent in calling out any side that has committed atrocities in this war. You know, I don't think there's any group that hasn't at some point had their hands bloodied, covered in blood. So the US is not taking sides in this at all. We're just trying to find a way to help the South Sudanese get to peace. And what we found in 2 failed attempts is that power sharing is not the answer.
Thanks so much, Ambassador Don Booth. This has been a very interesting discussion. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure everybody in the audience has learned a lot also. We, AFRECS, American Friends of the Episcopal Church in Sudan, appreciate all of you coming tonight and joining in. We're very anxious to push support for a solution in Sudan and for better days in South Sudan. So thank you for contributing to that process. We hope you'll stay in touch with AFRECS. Thank you.